Welcome to Earth+Humans, where we explore a problem in need of solutions. Hi, I'm Trisalyn Nelson, Professor and Director of the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning at Arizona State University. Growing up, I was one of 5 children. We spent a lot of time tracking equity. You got more ice cream. My cookie's the smallest. It's my turn to sit next to Mom. We were watchdogs ensuring no one got more. My mom, who raised us on her own, would exhaust from her role as referee and say, if you want life to be fair, go live in an orphanage. I get it, there's nothing fair about living in an orphanage, but I'm a mom now and I see her point. She was trying to ensure that 5 very different kids could thrive, and we were focused on equal portions of ice cream. In 2016, I moved from Canada to the US, and one of the things that has struck me every day since is how unfair society is. It isn't necessarily that the US is more unfair than Canada, though I do feel the absence of socialized medicine. It's more that being in a new place has made me observant. Variability in the built environment signals that people in our community are being left behind. A few blocks away from my middle-class neighborhood, people have vastly different access to education, income, food, and health care. And unlike my childhood family where everyone knew to complain to Mom, it can be unclear how to make change. A statistic on equity that sticks in my mind is from the Institute for Policy Studies that says the richest 1% own 45% of the world's wealth. Contextualize this with the UN projection that by 2050, 2.5 billion more people will live in cities, and you can see a growing issue. Are we really planning on having huge cities where 1% of people have 45% of the resources, or some cities that have no wealth at all? It's imperative that every single decision we make about cities and society includes an equity lens. If we don't prioritize equity, we can expect more hurt in the world. I'm proud that in the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning, faculty and students are promoting equity in research on topics like housing, transportation, and climate resilience. Today, on Earth+Humans, we're talking about urban equity. I'm really excited to welcome my first guest to Earth+Humans. Dr. Deirdre Pfeiffer is an associate professor in the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning at ASU, and she's also the program director for the Urban Planning program. Deirdre does work on housing and is also bringing expertise in public participation in planning. Thanks for being here with me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So we are going to kick off our first episode by really talking about urban equity and then getting into some of your individual research. So I have noticed, particularly on my social media feeds, a real uptick in equity sort of posts and stories in the last couple of years. I'm curious to get your perspective on why equity is really coming to the forefront of conversation.
Yeah, well, there are a couple reasons. So first of all, we're about 50 years plus out from the civil rights era, from the civil rights movement. And I'm talking about, all the policy changes that took place in mainly in the 1960s, but also in some of the decades before, that the intention of these was to create a level playing field for different social groups within our country, to create equal opportunity for different social groups. So people of different races and ethnicities, different genders and things like that. And 50 years out from that, we're aware that this was not enough, that there's still these persistent inequalities across social groups within the U.S. And so this reorientation, around equity now is coming out of that awareness. And another reason I would say is that, after the 2016 elections and the change in federal office and the Trump administration and some of the lack of commitment that the Trump administration has expressed and, continuing some of these civil rights era policies or even working towards greater gains in civil rights, and even dismantling some of the policies that we had established there, that's creating also a lot of concern about what that means for these different disadvantaged social groups that still 50 years out from the civil rights movement, are experiencing trouble getting a fair shake and having the same opportunities as people from other social groups. Trisalyn, yesterday I was chatting with you. I went to the Arizona Housing Forum, which is a conference that takes place annually that brings together people in the state who are working on issues around affordable housing, housing for low-income people, and so forth. And, it's like a place where different people working in housing get together, share stories, talk about challenges and things like that. Well, I saw this statistic that was presented there that really has sat with me all today, which brings home some of these persisting social inequalities that we're experiencing coming out of the civil rights era. The statistics were about homelessness and the disparate impact of homelessness on different social groups within Maricopa County. By disparate impact, I mean, how certain social groups in Maricopa County are more likely to experience homelessness than others. And what really struck me was there was this table showing differences in African Americans, non-Hispanic whites, as well as Latinos, and showing the proportion of the population that they represented in Maricopa County, the proportion of people in poverty that they represented in Maricopa County, and then the proportion of homeless people that they represented in Maricopa County. And I just want to give a few stats just to illustrate how this is just something in our own backyard that's happening right now. For African Americans, there's 6% of the population that we have in Maricopa County. They're 8% of the population in poverty that we have in Maricopa County, but they're 30% of the homeless population in Maricopa County. So we're seeing a huge gap, between, their representation in the population and their experience of homelessness. And just as a comparison piece, I just want to give the statistics for non-Hispanic whites in Maricopa County. So non-Hispanic whites are 83% of our population. They're 71% of the population in poverty, but they're only 58% of the population experiencing homelessness. So again, if we had equality, we would expect that African Americans to be 6% of the population experiencing homelessness, since they're 6% of our general population. Right. And likewise for whites, we would expect them to be 83% of this population experiencing homelessness, since they're 83% of our general population. So we see these huge gaps, and this is not unique to Maricopa County. This is all across the U.S. And so again, this is kind of circling back to your original question. There's this growing awareness that fighting for equality isn't enough. Rather, we have to fight for something called equity and social equity. So we're moving from this, awareness that we need to level the playing field to ensure that different social groups have equal opportunity to exceed, to actually giving different social groups different opportunities and different resources in order to get them to the same place that others are. So there's this image that if you just Google equity versus equality, you come across this image. You probably have seen it. But it's like a mother and, her two kids, one's 8 years old, one's 3 years old, that are trying to peek over the fence at a baseball game to watch the game. Have you seen this?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and so, equality is about giving everyone the same thing, so leveling the playing field. Everyone has equal access to, going to college or has different resources, to help them get by, whatever. Equity is about providing different levels of resources and different opportunities depending on where people are, in the game of life, so to speak, based on who they are. Yeah.
This reminds me, my sister-in-law is a kindergarten teacher, and she has a great quote that she once said when we were all together to our kids, which is, fair is not when everyone gets what they want. It's when everyone gets what they need. And,
you got it.
Right.
Yeah.
And different people are needing certainly different things. It's interesting that you bring up some of the local examples of inequity. I don't know if you've seen the map of, so for Maricopa County, there's a map that a number of organizations collaborated on, which shows life expectancy. Mm-hmm. And there's, it's probably 5 or 8 miles apart. There's 2 different postal codes. And in one, which is in Phoenix, you have a life expectancy of 71 years. And just a few miles away, up in Scottsdale, you will have a life expectancy of 85. So you see a 14-year difference in how long you'll get to enjoy life just based on where you live. And these places are not far. So can you comment from an urban planning perspective on, what's happening that causes this kind of difference, even within really a pretty close community in terms of proximity?
Yeah, well, so this is a part of, I would say, a growing area of the planning field right now. So basically two things are happening. So first of all, in the field of health sciences and all the subfields and so forth, there's a growing awareness that our health outcomes aren't just about what's happening within our bodies, but they're strongly affected by our environments. And so there's this movement in the health sciences to understand and document and change what are called the social determinants of health. In planning, planning is about managing the built environment. And so a large part of planning is about that. We also deal with the natural environment to some extent, but the built environment are, in our cities, the buildings, the infrastructure systems, the green and open spaces, that are governed by rules and regulations and so forth. And so there's a growing understanding within planning now of how our built environment that we're helping to manage is relating to people's health outcomes. And actually in planning, it's really interesting because it's a return to our roots in planning. The field of planning actually came out of this concern about health for people living within, the inner city and their access to parks and green spaces and fresh air and that sort of thing. So we're kind of going back to where we were,
Nice. Yeah.
It tends to happen, you cycle back in history. But anyway, so this map that you're talking about, which was produced, I'm pretty sure by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation with the head collaborators at Virginia Commonwealth University. I highly recommend all of our listeners Google this, to kind of see it for themselves. But what it's showing is the tremendous differences that exist within an urban area, within the built environments within an urban area, that affect people's well-being and directly affect some of their health outcomes, actually indirectly. What are some of these things I'm talking about? Well, we've been talking about parks a little bit, or I mentioned that. So differences in where parks are located within a region. What do parks offer us? They offer us space, as residents living in a city, space to exercise, but also a place that we can go and see other people and meet other people and connect with our neighbors and socialize and share information and knowledges. And these are things that can indirectly, affect our health, if we and so forth.
Right, but having a park is not enough if you have to have a safe park, an accessible park.
You got it.
So it's not just having the infrastructure there, but it's making sure it's accessible in a safe and healthy way.
You got it. Yeah. So there's so many different, layers on this. But long story short is that, people in health are starting to talk to people in planning again, after a long kind of hiatus and communication. And we're starting to try and figure out, well, how can we work together, to ensure that, we're dealing with some of these aspects of our environment that may have adverse influences on our health, or how can we promote those that have a positive influence?
Right.
So in planning, walkability, for instance, is something that, we're big on in planning. And there's a lot of research showing that, having access to more walkable environments, can indirectly affect our health outcomes by giving us more opportunity to exercise and so forth. And I'll just do one little plug before you move on.
Sure.
Which is, within our school, we have the Arizona Healthy Community Map through the Spark website.
Yes.
Which is a good spot for people to go to after looking at that life expectancy map, to be able to visualize what are the specific aspects of, the built environment in these neighborhoods that may be helping to drive some of those inequalities we see on that map. So that's a good spot for people to play around.
Yeah, that's great. And that's work that you and Dao Chin Tong did that was funded by the Vitalist Foundation, if I recall.
With Wang Shu Mu, who's a postdoc here as well. Yes,
Great.
Correct.
Great. So equity is important to a lot of disciplines. And one of the things I like about thinking about the topic in terms of curriculum, at least, is that it's really cross-cutting. But I think for planning, urban planning in particular, it has sort of a deep meaning. Can you talk a little bit about what equity means to the field of planning?
Yeah. Equity, basically the mission to work for greater social equity is deeply integrated into our Code of Ethics in planning. So in planning, we have something called the AICP Code of Ethics, which is AICP stands for the American Institute of Certified Planners Code of Ethics. So basically, professional planners in the field, if they want to be certified planners, they have to abide by this Code of Ethics in their work. And I just want to quote you a part of the Code of Ethics that deals
Great.
with social equity. So this part of the code goes, quote, "We shall seek social justice by working to expand choice and opportunity for all persons, recognizing a special responsibility to plan for the needs of the disadvantaged and to promote racial and economic integration. We shall urge the alteration of policies, institutions, and decisions that oppose such needs." And then end quote. And what I love that last line. That's a really like activist,
right? Action oriented.
Yeah, action oriented mission that we have as planners.
Do you feel like as an academic in planning that you have opportunities to take that action?
Oh yeah, and I have a lot. I'm privileged, so we're talking a little bit about privilege in this podcast. But I'm privileged to have more opportunity as an academic because what you look at in this part of the code. It sounds great, and it's something that's in the mind, of professional planners, but think of all the challenges that you could face as a professional planner in working, meeting this part of the mission. I mean, politics.
Right.
And, the fact that you were hired by this, larger institution that, is not immune to kind of shifts in politics. And so if you want to keep your job, you have to be careful, right? In a way that as a tenured faculty member at ASU, I have some more freedoms and being able to, advocate for different groups or speak my mind on these issues and act in other ways.
I feel like planning it does have a reputation based on some of the historical, like really negative things that have happened from an equity perspective. So plans that were made that didn't include vulnerable populations, or plans that were enacted that made inequities so much worse. So when did this AICP Code of Ethics come into place? Has it always been there, or is it a response to some of these historical events?
You got it. It's definitely a response to some of the abuses that came out of the way that planning was done prior to the civil rights era is when I would place that. So yeah, the code has gone through different revisions over time. So I'm reading you the version that's the most, up to date. But basically we start to see the development of this kind of mission coming out of that era. And there was a guy, Paul Davidoff, who he was a planner working in the 1960s, again, coming out of the era. You may have heard of Robert Moses, who was a very famous planner working in New York. And he was famous for, kind of having basically despising members of the public and seeing them as nuisances. And, he just wished all planning could be done basically in a room like we're sitting today, with people who are trained experts, and just, can we forget the noise? But what came out of that were some tremendous abuses with, famously highways cutting through, historic neighborhoods of people of color, where there were deep social connections and things like that. So Paul Davidoff, was coming out of that era and thinking about, well, how can we as planners not only not act in that way anymore, but actively advocate for disadvantaged groups and make sure that they have a seat at the table. And so he was writing a lot then, and he became famous for being what's called an advocacy planner. So basically, as a planner, giving your tools and resources to different community groups that are trying to, advocate for their neighborhoods or things going on and things like that. Yeah.
I feel like now, even though we don't always get it right, advocacy planning is actually just considered good planning.
You got it. Yeah.
A lot of our conversation has focused around Maricopa and Arizona. And we're, two white privileged academics at Arizona State University. What is our role, and what's the university's role in really addressing some of the equity issues that are in our community and more broadly nationally?
Yeah, well, we have a big role to play in offering up our skills and knowledge to people who are working on the ground on these issues already. So for instance, at this Arizona Housing Forum, what was I doing? I was like giving around my business card saying, hey, I was talking to someone working on eviction issues or homelessness issues, hey, if you guys have any needs with getting information or analyzing that information, let's talk. Let's see how I could help you out, or I could get students, to help you out. Maybe in my coursework, I can integrate some experiential learning thing, that helps you out, And so so that's one way we have a big role to play in just, using our tools or giving our tools to community groups and people working in the community. We also, I think there's also a role to play in bringing people from these communities into our classroom.
Right.
Too. And so, for instance, in my classes, I teach public participation planning and then housing planning and policy. And I have what I call like a practitioners panel at the end of each of the classes, where literally the last day of class, I bring people who are working out in the community in. And I like to focus on people who are working with diverse groups, who are working on issues of social equity, in our region or state. An example, like in my housing class, I used to bring in the director of the Arizona Coalition to End Homelessness, to talk about her work and what she's doing. I brought in people who work with the tribal communities and things like that. So, giving access to our tools to people within the community, bringing the community in, that's important. And then, we also have this other role of finding ways, to create opportunities for people to become educated here too.
Right.
So we have a real mission to serve the diverse people in Arizona, and we are continually thinking about ways that we can accomplish that.
It's one of the great things about thinking about equity at ASU is that access and equitable access is really core to our mission.
Mm-hmm.
And so it aligns so nicely that we can do a lot. One of the things that's happening in our schools as we focus on equity is we have a number of students doing equity-focused internships.
Right.
So we piloted that this summer, and we're hoping to grow that where students are working on equity. I love the examples that you bring up, because I notice that students are really energized by seeing how the tools that they're learning in a university setting can apply to solutions in the real world. Can you talk about how you incorporate equity into your teaching?
Yeah, so I have a couple different strategies I use. One of the ones that I expose people to on the first day of class, or first or second day, really early on, is to show them a chart or graph that tells a story about social equity. So my favorite chart that I show students, it's pretty simple. There's two trend lines. The first trend line is what's happening to incomes in the U.S., and the second trend line is what's happening to rents in the U.S. And what I show them is that over the past couple decades, incomes have basically flatlined, like pretty much, gone down, stayed the same, whereas we see this tremendous increase in rents in the U.S.
Oh, okay.
And what I love about that chart is it, again, shows that kind of gap, like we were talking about before with, the disparate impact of homelessness. It shows that gap in our housing market, where you have, people going out onto the housing market with incomes that are no much better off than they had 10 years ago, in a market where now the, average apartment is renting for so much more.
Right. So people are spending more of their income on housing.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Wow.
And I love that chart too, because students, this is a class that has a lot of undergraduates enrolled, and they've come to ASU and are finding apartments oftentimes for the first time, and so this is very much an issue that is meaningful to them.
So maybe just to wrap up, can you tell me about one project in your research that you're really excited about?
Yeah, well, so in general, my research deals with so I focus on housing, and how housing is both a cause but also an effect of these trends and growing social inequities that you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. So how housing is a cause means, how do decisions that we make about housing, the way it's planned, the way we build housing, affect people's life chances, right? And then the other side is, because of people's experience kind of in our economy and some of the growing inequalities, how do they try and adapt through their housing, or how do they use their housing to adapt? So just an example of one project that's on that kind of, housing as a cause of social inequality and trying to understand that relationship. I've been working for a couple years trying to understand this great shift that came out of the recent Great Recession. So, many of our listeners probably, they've heard, or they, were experiencing the foreclosure crisis that happened. Right. So millions of homeowners within the U.S. underwent foreclosure. Now, what happened was a lot of those properties that underwent foreclosure, they were bought up by investors, meaning people who didn't intend to live in that property, but actually they wanted to rent it out. And so what we saw happen was this big shift in our housing market where we had a large number of single-family homes in the U.S. that used to be owner-occupied transitioned to be rentals. And so we have neighborhoods now where there used to be primarily homeowners living in these neighborhoods, and now we have a mix of renters and homeowners.
Interesting.
So what I've done in my research is to understand, what has that shift in the housing market done in terms of changing opportunities where people can live in the U.S. So one project that I worked on a couple of years ago in Maricopa County was trying to understand, these new rental opportunities that are opening up in neighborhoods where previously there were a few options to rent in these communities. Have they created more opportunities for low-income people who are more likely to be renters to live in these areas? And is it opening up access to low-income people to live in neighborhoods that have some of the amenities, better amenities that usually are attached to neighborhoods that have higher owner occupancy rates? And I did find to some extent that this transition opened up neighborhoods for low-income people to live in places with lower poverty and higher rates of households having college degrees and stuff like that. So it was kind of interesting.
That is interesting.
Right now, though, what I'm working on is trying to understand the nationwide picture. So looking at neighborhoods across the country that experience big increases in their proportion of rentals, what's happening to those neighborhoods over time?
Well, thank you so much for being here with me. This has been a conversation with Dr. Deirdre Pfeiffer.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Earth+Humans, produced by the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning at Arizona State University. You can learn more about our school by visiting sgsup.asu.edu. Music for this podcast is brought to you by Zachary Wiggins and Samuel Pena. This episode was executive produced by Megan Martin. Now get out there and be part of this solution.